great pleasure to this event that we're co-sponsoring. So we have a wonderful panel here. If you want any information about our program, just let me know. Please feel free to go out and refresh yourself with food. We have plenty of food. I'm not going to take up any more time, but I will introduce Greg from the DC Bar. So thank you all.
Hi, I am Greg Whittier. So I'm not with the DC Bar as such. I'm an attorney in private practice, but I'm one of the co-chairs of the Animal Law Committee. My co-chair, Becca Carey, works at the Humane Society, is right over there. First of all, I just wanted to thank GW for giving us the space and helping with all of the many logistics involved in setting up the program and providing the wonderful plant-based food. If you are interested in learning more about the Animal Law Committee, we are part of the environmental, energy, and natural resources community of the DC Bar. If you do not be a member of that, to join, you can email me and or Becca. My email is glipper, Glipper, @lipperlaw.com. And Becca is rcarey, Cary, @humanesociety.org. So email one or both of us, and we will sort of add you to the list and send you information about our meetings and other stuff we have going on. That's all the preliminaries I have, so we'll get started with the program. Our moderator today is Kailey McNeal. Kailey, those of you who are students now, Kailey may know her. Kailey graduated from GW Law School last June, and she now is an associate at Jones Day. She's a member of the DC Bar Animal Law Committee. She was also a member of the People and Paws Coalition for Affordable Housing, which was one of the main advocates supporting the pets and housing legislation that you will be hearing more about on the panel. So thank you so much, Kailey.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for coming. I'm really, really excited to be here. There's a wealth of knowledge here in the pets and housing space, and I'm very excited for you all to hear from these amazing 4 speakers. I'm going to give a really brief introduction, just so you have sort of an idea of how much knowledge we're working with here. And then I'm going to pass it over to them and ask some questions. I would love, if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hands, let me know. I'll start out with a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up to you all and see what you all want to hear. So we'll start first with Lauren Loney right here. She's an attorney, researcher, and advocate in the animal welfare, affordable housing, and environmental justice movements. She has worked for various animal policy organizations and has co-authored publications and given several presentations on the intersection between animal welfare and housing justice. And we will definitely be talking about some of the research that Lauren did in this space, that it's just been so groundbreaking for passing legislation of this sort. And she has now brought her talents to DC, where she lives with her 3 dogs, Daffodil, Ranger, and Sai. I was just trying to make sure I say it right. Okay, next we have Kelly Whittier. Kelly is a volunteer organizer, I should say the volunteer organizer for the People and Paws Coalition, which was a collective of organizations developed to pass the Pets and Housing Amendment Act of 2024 in the district. It's now also known as Roscoe's Law. She got her start in DC animal advocacy, working as the director of communications and legislative aid at the DC Council, where she championed animal issues. She has also worked at and worked with GW in various capacities, and now is the director of public affairs at the Humane Rescue Alliance. Yeah. And she lives with her rescued boy, Lewis, who is just a sweetheart. Okay, next we have David Meit, a certified and accredited property manager, realtor, and real estate broker. He is the founder and principal of Oculus Realty, LLC, an accredited management organization that has led the industry in pet-friendly communities. He's an expert witness in the sphere of landlord-tenant law, fair housing compliance, and operational best practices. And David also shares his life with his dog, whose name I don't think I ever knew it.
Basil.
Basil. I got to meet Basil on Zoom the other day. And so we are so excited to have you here with us today to talk about pet-friendly communities.
Kailey, I forgot to introduce your dog, so.
Oh.
Great.
Yes, I share my home with two actually, although one makes appearances more often than the other, but with two rescue pit bulls, Zelda and Nakia. Okay, so last but not least, we have Susan Riggs joining us via Zoom here. Susan is the Senior Director of Housing Policy for the ASBCA's Government Relations Department, where she directs their pet-friendly housing initiatives. Prior to the ASBCA, she worked for various organizations in the affordable housing policy space in California, where she currently lives with her rescue kitty, Bella, who might be on the cat, sometimes is behind you on Zoom. She might be there today.
On the other side of the couch.
On the other side, okay. And we're so lucky to have Susan who got to tune in here, even though she's all the way in California. So we're really happy to have you here. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys now. So I think in order to give everyone just a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about pets and housing, because that's a huge issue with a lot of different components, it would be great if each of you could just speak for a few minutes about what your role in that space is and what issues you focus on in that space. If anybody wants to start, we can go down the list, or if anyone wants to start.
I guess I'll start. Well, as Kailey indicated, I'm actually a housing provider, so I'm a practitioner of providing housing. And I never grew up with a dog, but about 10 years ago, we decided to have a dog, mostly because of a family issue, and absolutely fell in love. Now, one of the people that were very instrumental in that was Lisa LaFontaine. Lisa and I served on the Vistage a CEO group together, and I really learned a lot about animals, dogs in particularly, and how important they are. And as a housing provider for 30 years, yeah, we accepted dogs. There was breed restrictions, there was weight restrictions. It was just kind of a side thing. Didn't really understand the importance of the human-animal bond. We got our dog Basil, who just turned 9, and really kind of fell in love and started understanding this connection. And I realized that everybody should have this connection, including all of the residents that live in my apartment buildings. And so I started doing some research. I met a wonderful woman named Judy Bellick, which works for Nicholson Found Animals, which I think you're familiar with, right? We're very close, and she's got 3 beautiful Shibus. And she really got me into this about 7 or 8 years ago. And we went all in. I did a lot of research on this concept of breed restrictions and weight restrictions. And that's when I learned, everybody deserves the dog that they manage, and so that there really is no bad dog. There's only bad owners. And I've had a lot of experience managing workforce housing where we've had issues, the classic pit bull fighting dog kind of thing. But we've also had just a lot of wonderful dogs. And so we realized that this was, frankly, a good thing to do. And I'm here to tell you, it's also very good business. So we've won a lot of awards over those several years on being very pet inclusive, not pet friendly, pet inclusive, where we have no breed restrictions, we have no weight restrictions. We do go through a kind of an interview process. We want to meet all the dogs. One of my favorite things to do. I don't get to do it personally very often, but we love to do that. And we make all of our apartment communities extremely pet inclusive, and it creates community, which creates stickiness. So my residents don't want to leave, and we have great events. I have a property in Frederick. I have 86 units. I have 42 dogs and 17 cats, and we love every minute of it. So that's kind of how I got into it, and we love it.
I don't think any of us probably get to actually work with animals as much as we would like in this role, right? Despite being in the animal welfare space. Yeah, I feel that way at least.
Lauren, do you want to go next?
Let me go. Okay, sure. So I also got my start professionally working in the tenants' rights and affordable housing spaces. My first real legislative research, once I was out of law school, was in ways that in the state of Texas, which is where I'm from, I graduated from University of Texas School of Law, ways that our policies could better ensure the preservation of subsidized affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that had gentrified, where housing used to be, the housing was built in a very racially and economically segregated way. Now, over the years, that neighborhood had changed a lot. And what would end up happening is that housing would end up being sold. They would exit their affordability requirements and they would be sold to turn into market rate housing. So my start was really in the housing space, and I always was dabbling in animal welfare policy work as a volunteer. And as I was working on these issues, I just quickly realized how there was this massive overlap in companion animal welfare, the human-animal bond, and the policies that either support that bond and keep people and pets together, or they serve to separate folks from their pets. And so essentially, I realized there is this deep connection that at the time, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to work on. And I eventually took a position as the Texas State Director for the Humane Society of the United States. And pretty much immediately that next legislative session started working on legislation related to the use of non-refundable pet fees and monthly pet rents in rental housing. And that is today most of my focus area in both the research space, where we I do publish research on these issues, and then also my focus area in legislative advocacy.
So, Kelly?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I'm bookended by two like housing and tenant experts, and my sort of like foray to this issue is a little different. Working, for Councilmember Mary Che, Professor Che, for everyone here at the law school, it was a little different. Like, we were really responding to immediate pressing needs for wildlife, for domestic animals, for trying to equip humane law enforcement with the tools that they needed to combat cruelty in the district. And so we were sort of, moving in sort of in a lot of different directions. And so, at the end of my tenure on the council, we were really trying to get this major omnibus bill across the finish line, which had, several things, didn't touch housing at all. But that was always sort of like that kernel in the back of my mind of like, we are responding to so many things that are, rightfully so focused on animals. But, I come from like more of a public health background in education. I'm like, well, we know that people are associated with every animal as well. So when I left the council, I was like, gosh, I really wanted to tackle exorbitant pet rent, something that I think probably a lot of us in this room have also experienced. I was like, if only I could, in a volunteer capacity, get back involved with some of our, the partners at the university, at the Humane Rescue Alliance, which I have now joined, which was a surprise. This is my first week. So, I basically, like 2 years ago, reached out to Max Broad from DC Voters for Animals, the Humane Rescue Alliance, and Professor Joan at GW, which is like such a pillar in this work. And I was like, I have this idea and I want to do X, Y, and Z. And they were like, we are already working on those things. And that sort of like was the organic growth and sort of like foundation for the People in Paws Coalition for Affordable Housing. And even when we were, and it's interesting because it really expanded and grew in this really interesting organic way from a hyper local small group of people who cared to regional partners and national experts. And I think that that's really what you want to see when passing legislation, specifically in the district, is to have that sort of organic growth from grassroots efforts. But even in our name decision-making, we're like, let's put people first, right? Like centering people and their needs at the heart of this issue, not only as like a strategy for us to be successful, but as a reminder that, we are serving animals and the people who love them.
The bond.
Yeah.
All right, Susan, you want to hop in here?
Yeah. Oh, first of all, let me say, I'm so sorry for not being there in person. We are knee deep right now in the legislative session. I've got multiple bills being heard next week. So it's a bit chaotic in at the ASPCA right now as we try and get through our first committees. So all of that to say, I am, as Kailey said, I'm Senior Director of Housing Policy for the ASPCA, and that's a pretty unique role among animal welfare organizations. I mean, there's folks that are dedicated to various things, puppy mills and those types of things, but housing is pretty unique. And that really just grew out of my expertise in housing. I'd been working in the affordable housing and just general housing space for a decade and a half. And when the A hired me, they were really excited about my housing background because they recognized that, you know, housing instability is really a driver of surrenders, you know, to shelters. And, you know, we wanted to come up with interventions there. And so I did that in kind of a general role, lobbying in the West Coast states for a number of years. And it was so attractive to legislators because it really combined two issues, housing and animal welfare, that they really loved to work in. And so we found that we wanted to do more of it. And so this role was actually created 3 years ago. And I work primarily at the state level. So I work doing primarily state legislation. We do run federal bills as well, but as you might imagine, recent years have not been very productive at the federal level. So we'll keep trying. But so just to kind of give you a sense of some of the work that I've done since I've been in this role, it really spans, you know, from ensuring that homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters are inclusive of pets. And, you know, there's various reasons for that. You know, primarily, you know, we want to get folks to safety, and not allowing their pets really become an impediment to doing that. And so we need to make sure that, you know, these safe places for people that are vulnerable, you know, are inclusive of the you know, their furry companions that they love and they will not leave behind. And so that's really an imperative. So we've worked on lots of legislation around that. And then, you know, kind of on the other end, we worked to pass some of the first legislation in the nation that prohibited insurance companies from putting dog breed exceptions in property insurance, liability insurance policies. And so that was really the focus at that point, was really, you know, if you have to get a mortgage and you own your home and you have a pit bull or you have a German Shepherd or a boxer, or, you know, any number of quote unquote dangerous breeds, you might not get insurance. And that is problematic from, you know, from the perspective of, you know, home ownership and being able to, you know, manage the requirements of your mortgage, of the bank that is, has your mortgage. But over time, we've recognized that it's more than just home ownership. And in a large part now, our focus is on the renters and the landlords. We know that, especially post-COVID, most landlords are requiring renters insurance when they allow dogs or pets on the property, that they're asking their renters to get renters insurance. And again, those breed restrictions apply there. And so we want to make sure that, you know, there aren't those exclusions or rate hikes that are associated with particular breeds. Next week, I'm going to be in the state of Nevada and in the state of Colorado, expanding those existing provisions that we've already passed into law in those states for landlord policies as well. And so we want to expand to make sure that, you know, if a landlord is willing to take all breeds of dogs, that they're not operating in a gray area, that they're, you know, protected. And so and the irony in all of this is the vast majority of what's called dog-related incidents, that's what insurance companies call it, are trip and falls. They're not aggressive incidents. And so, you know, if a landlord accepts, you know, German Shepherds on their property, but their insurance company says we don't cover German Shepherds, and, you know, someone who has mobility issues is on the property and trips over that German Shepherd, there's that gray area that the insurance company may or may not cover that claim. And so we want to make sure that that is not the case. And so, you know, that's kind of the span of things we're doing. But obviously, in the middle of that, especially post-COVID, we're seeing a lot of reforms at the state level around landlord assessed rental fees of all types, But one of the places that is hardest hit is in the area of pets, pet-related costs. And so, we're seeing those in 3 categories right now. We're seeing pet rent, pet deposits, and upfront pet non-reimbursable pet fees. And so we're seeing just, broadly across the United States right now, at the state level and at the local level, that, there's a urgency to address that as our shelters, our animal shelters are over capacity because of folks having to surrender because of limitations on their ability to rent with their pets. So I will wrap up my introduction there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so we've clearly talked about a lot of issues already, just in those few minutes. So I think this is a selfish question because we are at the GW Animal Law program and many of us in this space are animal advocates. So I'm really curious to hear from David a perspective that I don't often get to hear, but that is really important in this space. What do you see as the biggest obstacles or issues with for housing providers in regards to being pet inclusive? I was going to say pet friendly, but I like your word better, pet inclusive.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. History. It's, unfortunately, property management is not a cutting edge industry. We tend to move very slowly with change. And, this concept, it was the CDC who came out with this breed restriction issues back in the 60s, which has completely been debunked at this point. But landlords kind of learned about it and took advantage of it, and then it became very ingrained. I have a client right now that I just helped build a beautiful building, and he inherited his company from his father, and that's always been their policy. And I can't seem to get him to understand that it's an antiquated policy. And I think it's inertia is kind of the biggest issue, people understanding. And then, as Susan said, the whole issue with insurance is fascinating. And as Kailey indicated, I do a lot of expert witness work in standard care and property management, and I've done many cases dealing with animal issues, litigation. It's usually around the ESA, which we can talk about. Not so much trip, although we did have a trip on a leash, interestingly enough. But that is actually less of an issue, at least in my world, because most insurance policies with the major habitational carriers like Hartford, Travelers, Zurich, Chubb, they tend to, that's not really an issue anymore. They kind of understand that. So, and in regards to our renters insurance, we have it all over the board. Honestly, I've never really looked to see if it's an issue on that. So when she was saying that, I was thinking, I wonder if I should ask. A lot of those are State Farm or Nationwide or Lemonade or, these renters insurance kind of policies. But again, I've never seen that really be an issue. It really is the inertia and understanding of educating people, educating housing providers of what is the reality of breeds and how well they may be managed, and then how we can create an environment that creates that very community-based, animal-based environment. That help?
Yes. yes, thank you. And kind of building on that, do you think, are there differences based on the size of the housing provider, what issues there are? So for example, I know this is an issue that Kelly would bring up a lot in our People in Paws coalition, but there's a lot of like smaller housing providers, in addition to the giant, management companies that we think of. What experience do you have about the different issues that are presented to those?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, something I see a lot from my own experience and in my expert witness work is the difference is education and training. The small housing provider usually, may own a couple houses, single family homes that they may rent themselves, or even have a third party management company do that. And they don't tend to have the accreditations training that a professional property managers do to understand and learn. And by the way, it's not just housing. I mean, not just pets. It's fair housing, it's mold, it's, lead paint. these are the kind of things that they just aren't aware of because nobody grows up saying they want to be in property management. There's only like 3 universities that even teach it as a course. And so that's where I really see the difference is just that level of understanding. So one of the things that I know Mickelson Found Animals and the Pet Housing Initiative does is trying to get that information out to all housing providers. And so, yes, I agree. Now, that being said, there are small housing providers who love animals and understand them because they grew up with them and it's never been an issue. And then you have large management companies that are still stuck in their old ways. So there is no one rule.
That's helpful. So this is broadly speaking to all of you. How do you see the issue of pet inclusive housing pet inclusive housing fitting into the broader landscape of housing insecurity, housing instability? Generally, we're kind of, I feel like maybe we're always in a crisis, but we're kind of in a crisis of housing right now. How do you see those two things? Is this just like a little piece of it? Is this, how does this play?
I guess I'll go with that also, but I'm very interested in hearing what my colleagues say. Affordable housing is such a large, intricate topic, and there's so many things that go into that, which we're really not going to get into today. Although, Lauren, I'd love to have that conversation with you. It's just another impediment. And so I think that now that I, over the last decade, truly understand that animal-human bond and understand how important that is, to have to give up your companion because of a housing requirement is extremely damaging to society as a whole, in my opinion, which is why we've chosen to be very pet inclusive. But again, there's income issues, there's safety issues, there's crime issues, there's domestic violence issues. There's so many things that go into that. And frankly, in my opinion, if you have an animal as a companion, people who own animals are great people. And I'm a big believer of that. And I think that would probably solve some of these other issues as well. That might be pie in the sky, but I'm going to stick by it.
Yeah, I think, to your point, Kailey, I mean, we are in not only a subsidized affordable housing crisis where we have not a single state in the country that has enough affordable and available housing for all extremely low income households. So we not only have a crisis in terms of subsidized affordable housing and not having enough of that, but even in market rate housing, we have a crisis of housing affordability that extends much broader than just those who would fit into the extremely low income or very low income categories. Just this past year, Harvard released a report that reported that half of American rental households are housing cost burdened, which means that they spend more than 30% of their monthly rent on housing related expenses, with a huge chunk of that being extremely housing cost burdened, meaning they spend at least 50% of their total household income on housing expenses. So we are talking about an epidemic of housing affordability that is, I think there are a lot of issues for that affordability, a crisis that we're in that is too much for tonight. But I think that unfortunately pets and the human animal bond, not in every case, of course, but in a lot of ways are also being caught up in this affordability crisis, right? There is a lot of exploitative use of non-refundable fees and pet rents out there. Not everyone and not all the time, of course. There are examples, but I think it's kind of two sides of one coin where the human animal bond is so important and people will get into situations where they can't really afford the rent that they're paying in order to be able to keep their pet. Or if we're talking about the subsidized affordable housing, folks will choose to live in substandard housing because that's where they can afford and keep their pet. So we did some research using intake data from 21 animal shelters across the US who are Human Animal Support Services, HOS, if anybody's familiar with them, pilot shelters, and our data from that research that was published last year showed that pet relinquishment due to loss of home, which is of course completely separate from this idea of pets and housing, right? It's just due to loss of home in general. It's actually on the rise over the last since 2019. And so I think what we're seeing now is this consequence of a broader affordable, housing crisis on animal shelters. And so I think that where we're at with the crisis of housing being, the number one or number two reason for relinquishment, that's a consequence of a broader affordable housing issue and affordability issue that really, I think until we have some big systemic conversations about access to housing in general, we're not likely to see massive shifts or changes in relinquishments to animal shelters, due to underlying housing issues.
Thanks for that. Thanks both. Kelly, Susan, do either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just add one little layer. I mean, we spend literally in this country billions of dollars to address homelessness, whether it's veteran homelessness or family homelessness. And, one thing that we absolutely know is that the ability to stay together with your pets is a factor there, and people choosing to remain homeless. And the intervention for that is so cost effective. We have here in California, we've had a program, the Pet Assistance Support Program that's allocated now $16 million to homeless shelters across the state. The homeless shelters have gobbled up this money. It's been oversubscribed 2 to 1. They're begging for more money, understanding that this is an easily solvable barrier to bringing people off the street. And so we're throwing money at the problem. And just for a couple $100,000 more per shelter, you can make those shelters, you can accommodate pets in those shelters and really remove a barrier to bringing those folks off the streets. And so, I think that's just one, obviously demographic in the housing market, but we know that, pets dramatically affect people's decision-making, as Lauren has already alluded to. They make choices based upon being able to keep their pets with them, and very difficult choices. And we don't want them to have to make those choices. We want them to be able to live in, suitable housing that's affordable to them, where they can keep their families together. So I just wanted to add that layer.
Thanks, Susan. So we've talked a lot about the issues and the problems. I'd like to transition a little bit into talking about what the heck we do with all of this. So I think several of us worked on the DC bill, but I don't want to just restrict this conversation to that. But I think there's some interesting points that we can take away from there. But what are just some, I guess, what are the different interests that you have to think about when deciding how to address this pets and housing issue? If you're, wanting to change a law or create a law to try and make some change, what sort of interests you need to be considering?
Like stakeholders?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can also sort of start with, oftentimes I think it's very difficult for legislators to allocate the appropriate amount of time, staff resources, attention, just care and buy-in from their colleagues in order to sort of spearhead animal legislation. So oftentimes, like the successful strategy in the district has been, we can sort of bundle multiple ideas together into one bill, at least have like sort of one effort moving forward rather than several different, pieces of legislation. So we often move like omnibus packages or other things like that. So with the Pets and Housing Act specifically, it touches upon a few different things, right? It tackles pet rent and exorbitant fees. It addresses, breed prohibitions. It also addresses, and hopefully this budget cycle will be able to sort of press the council to allocate funding for the pet-friendly homeless shelter. So these are very different populations, right? Like in very different needs. And when you're also putting together very distinct and separate communities, you're also looking at potentially different committees for a bill to be referred to. And those were some strategic decisions that we had to, I mean, and I think not all of us are like fully satisfied with the bill at the end of the day, right? It's compromise in a lot of ways, but when we had approached Councilmember Robert White, we had a much bigger bill, a broader bill, one that included an insurance provision, one that included a pet-friendly domestic violence shelter, right? To help people and their, children transition into safer environments with their pet, so that that animal isn't used as a tool to harm or be vulnerable itself, right? So unfortunately, well, what ultimately happens through the legislative process is the member will assess like what they think they can be, what they think will pass, what will be successful, and what will get a good referral. There are plenty of different referral mechanisms at the council. You could get a subsequent referral where, your member might be ready to advance this legislation and it might get kicked to a different committee that is just going to sit on it because it's not a priority. So I think that looking at what you want to do and how you might be able to strategically tie them together to, sort of like not fast track, but certainly like easier path forward through the legislative process is probably a good place to start.
Kelly always in the coalition for me brought the
I'm
no
the worst.
no the really, because those strategic conversations are so important, and it's really important to go to the table knowing that you are likely going to compromise coming out the other side, right? Because of this issue, especially whenever you're working on a bill that has many different parts to it, there's going to be different stakeholders that come together that are interested in the different parts of this bill. And so, you need to understand the positions and really work with the folks who are running the shelters, who are serving, folks who are victims of domestic violence, and the housing providers, the animal shelter stakeholders, and then there's the advocacy groups and all of the pet owners, the people who have pets in the city who are really affected by this. I think that when you have housing related issues, you're already working on something that's intersectional. You want to bring your tenants' rights groups to the table and your affordable housing advocates to the table at the same time to make sure that what you're working on is additive, hopefully, to what they're already doing in the tenants' rights and housing justice spaces. And then you have to get to the logistics of what can be reasonably included to make sure we don't have to go to 2 different committees. So there's multiple layers, I think, of in this work in particular that in some other maybe more siloed areas of animal welfare, you don't necessarily have to consider it as much. Susan, I'm sure.
I know, just Susan, do you want to jump in? I know you've worked on not just the DC bill, but on several bills. So if you want to share any of your experiences there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of our focus is on landlord concerns, and those really are emanate from 2 kind of different areas, that we've kind of alluded to. One is insurance and liability, and how do we address those? And obviously you've heard for that at this point. The other piece is damage. And so, we really have to get to the root of, how do we make sure that landlords have a comfort level for being protected from irresponsible owners. And, I'm a firm believer that it's oftentimes not the pets that are the problem. It really is about, irresponsible, neglectful owners who aren't getting their pets enough exercise or not, doing the things that they need to do to make sure that their pets are managed when they're in the property. And so, I think thinking creatively around those 2 issues will go a long way to opening up more housing and coming up with solutions. And, we continue to think through, in some cases, things that have fiscal impacts. And, I think one of the things that hasn't been raised yet in terms of kind of the complexity of moving legislation that is going to solve these problems is really the timing of them. we've been working for quite some time on a pet-friendly landlord mitigation fund. The idea being that, we believe based upon the data, David's alluded a couple of times to the Michelson Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative that found that, pets really don't do an enormous amount of damage overall. The average is about $200. Most tenants will repair that damage before they let it be taken out of their security deposit. And so I think the short story of the data that we have is that, pet related damage should be covered just by a security deposit. But I think, every landlord has, some story, where there's been thousands of dollars worth of damage. And so how do we make sure that that story doesn't end up creating much larger the consequences that are happening now, which all landlords are concerned about accepting pets. And so the idea behind this landlord mitigation fund is that, if you're willing to accept all breeds and weights and not charge exorbitant deposits and pet rent and all of these things, then, we've got a fund to help cover, excessive wear and tear or excessive damage to your property. The problem with that, of course, is creating that fund at a time that, states are experiencing huge budget deficits. It's impossible. We're in Colorado, we put it in our legislation this year that's going to be heard next week. And, the governor immediately came to us and said, we can't do this. We're doing, rental subsidy cuts right now. And so the idea of creating a whole new fund to help support tenants with pets just doesn't make any sense at all in this context. And so, so we, may have to hit pause on that for a little while until the budget outlook is better for states, but we're not going to give up on that potential solution to some of this. And I think at the end of the day, one thing that I believe will bear out once we get, those types of funds implemented is that they're really not highly utilized and will probably debunk a lot of the myth around, pets doing so much damage. There may be that, 1 in 1,000 that is an irresponsible owner that, really impacts everybody. But the reality is that is really just, 1 in 1,000 and not, not every tenant with a pet.
Thanks for that, Susan. So did you have
No, I was
wanted
just-
to add?
yeah,
So I want to talk a little bit just about logistics wise, like how somebody does something like this, how somebody tackles issues like this. So you have all of these competing interests and all these compromises to make. How do you do that? Like, how do you engage in conversations with your legislators or with your local housing providers to talk about changing policies or to talk about getting, like, how do you approach that conversation? What do you
You're
do?
describing advocacy.
Yeah, and specifically in this space, how do you go about doing that kind of thing? I know with the DC bill, we were very lucky to have Kailey with us because Kailey works on council and is like our council savior and knows all about the DC council and was able to kind of shepherd us through. But what sort of steps can people take to do that when they don't have that experience, or when it's maybe not a law they want to change, but they want to talk to their housing provider about being more pet inclusive? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Listen more than talk.
Mhm.
That's what I found. I've never done advocacy in the animal welfare area, but I've done a lot of advocacy in housing, particularly in DC. I helped write the 2006 Omnibus Housing Act, which adjusted rent control and a few other things. And my experience with that was how important it was to listen and to understand all the stakeholders' concerns and try to address them. And I think the beauty of our government, or public government, is that we have lots of stakeholders. And I think what unfortunately we don't have in Congress is people that listen to each other and they just talk at each other and they don't make compromise, and that's how things get done. Again, and that's completely as a layman. These are the guys that are actually, in government and do the advocacy work. I just support where I can. But I've always found, and maybe it's just because I've been in business for such a long time, or in life for such a long time, it's just listening. and hearing what somebody else has to say and creating and finding common ground. My 2 cents.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
I think if you are coming at this from just like you're an average citizen and you want to speak to your city council member or your representative, your legislator, the most important thing I think that you can do is share how this has impacted your life.
Yeah.
What your experience has been with any of these things, whether it's, you know, pets and housing or something else, but often, that is, I think, a good starting point. I think, you know, I would often share our experience with moving to DC with 3 dogs from the state of Colorado and how difficult it was for us to find housing that would allow 3 dogs. And then once we found housing and we had committed to the place where we live and turned down other leases, they then attempted to tack on $50 a month per pet for us to keep our 3 20-pound or less dogs in our apartment with us. And then we subsequently found out that even with that, we didn't have access to the yard that was at the house. So I think that, like, sharing your experience, even as a professional in this space, I think how I am personally impacted is a good place to start. So if you're just a person out there and wanting to bring attention to an issue, sharing how you are impacted if you volunteer at an animal shelter and you see pets that are coming into that shelter because their person couldn't find a place to live that they could afford and that allowed them, that's another good example. But you don't have to be an expert in any of these spaces in order to be a strong advocate for the issue. So I don't know. I do a lot of like encouraging citizen advocacy and sort of grassroots work. And that is often what we encourage our members to do, is just share their own experiences.
Yeah. And also I will say, like, Lauren, the day of the vote was like a critical person on the ground. So like you have to be ready to even just be there in person.
Yeah.
And do have that elevator, like literal elevator pitch ready. You might catch yourself physically in an elevator or following a member in and they are a captive audience. And like those are your moments to like address the concerns. Like you have to listen to them as well, like what they're really saying.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is like critical and also reflects better on you as sort of a trusted voice when you're making your sort of like legislative pitch to a decision maker is to like do your homework and be really prepared. After,
100%.
yeah, you know, you have to, one, know a lot of, make sure you're talking to the right people, make sure you know the history and general interests of the person that you're pitching. Are they also the right person to spearhead this initiative? Councilmember White is the chair of the housing committee. Like if there was any person to sort of like be our champion in this effort, it would be him. He also had a rescue dog. So I think
Who was a pit bull?
who was a pit bull, like who was a local rescue. So I think like knowing your audience, doing your homework. After we had our initial meeting with his legislative director, the legislative director pulled me aside afterwards. He's like, that was the most thorough like presentation I've ever had from an advocacy organization. And it's because I think we did a lot of on the ground research early, tried to address and get ahead of the top level concerns that we knew would sort of be thrown back at us, and just show that we were, you know, prepared and professional. And I think that oftentimes there's this maybe narrative or notion of, you know, we even have terms like the crazy cat lady, right? Like people, it's hard to be a legitimate voice in the animal advocacy space because it's not considered as serious as people issues. And that's why I think like showing that
people issue.
but yet it is a people issue,
Yeah.
and emphasizing like what that bond means and why this is so important is just as important as being prepared when you go into those meetings and doing a little bit of homework.
And I'd like to add, just because I know we have law students here, students in general, is that is advice in every part of your life, is be prepared. And particularly if you're trying to affect change. If you know what you're doing, it'll make a big difference.
Susan, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think those were great responses.
I have.
You call Susan That's what you do when you want.
I have a lot more questions, but I want to give folks an opportunity to ask a question if they have one in the audience. Does anybody have
Come
any
on, don't be
questions
shy.
they'd like to ask?
This is why you don't feed them first.
Obligatory.
Look at us going. Hello, so it's on. Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about what was and was not included in the DC ordinance and some of the, I know we talked sort of more broadly about compromises that have to happen, but
That's a great question.
since we have so many experts on here and probably not everyone has read the substance of it, maybe just a little bit more of the details about what was in there.
Should I take this?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the sort of top things that were not included in the introduction and that we weren't able to get added back in as amendments were like insurance protections for landlords, renters, and homeowners. The other component was really narrowing the shelter scope to folks who are experiencing homelessness. The other sort of like major change was the fee structure. So one of the things that we had proposed, and this was also like the early debates that we were engaging in as a coalition of what is fair? Like, what is fair? How much is reasonable for, a tenant to, pay every month for their pet? What is a reasonable pet deposit? It's funny because I wish we had known each other earlier because I would have loved to have asked your thoughts on that. But one of the, the significant changes was that we were proposing like a flat cap, right, of like $25 a month, with the idea that we might have to negotiate up. Once we actually got, and that was what was introduced, but once the council member was having conversations with other like stakeholders in the district, other landlords, like larger and luxury property providers, they were saying that that really wouldn't necessarily like address their major concerns with the fact that we're taking money away from housing providers, right? So we're taking, the carrot away from actually opening doors to pets. So one of the things that was a significant change and was, I think, a bit of a surprise, like to be fully candid from the coalition, is that it changed to a percentage of rent. And so one of the things is that, you might say, and I think a lot of us would perhaps like advocate, is that we want everyone to have, reasonable pet fees. What does reasonable mean for someone who has, a $2,000 a month lease versus someone who's, say, in a luxury apartment building or renting a whole home for maybe like $5,000, $7,000? What's the really expensive one in DC that's reasonable?
Like 15.
15,000.
A penthouse.
Right. Does it make sense? And from the perspective from the council and, the people that they were speaking to, is it reasonable for someone who's, renting a $15,000 a month apartment building to pay $25? When we talk about, the idea that these are the ideas that we're also, combating, is that pets may cause damage. Those fixtures in that, I'm assuming, very nice apartment building are going to be, more expensive to replace. So like, what is reasonable? Where the council ultimately landed was a percentage. So instead of a flat $25 cap, now we're at 1% of your month's rent. One of the gains that was maintained, though, was the elimination of non-refundable pet fees, right? And I think that that is hopefully going
Cap
and
at
the
the deposit.
and the cap at the deposit. Thank you. Which is, I think, a major gain in terms of fairness for people, right? Like, if my animal causes damage, it's my responsibility. And I think we talk a lot about responsible pet ownership at the same time. I know every time I have to dodge a brown gift left in a tree box in DC, I'm mad at that pet owner, right? And so there are a lot of people who are perhaps more lax than they should be in like maintaining their pets and their spaces. So that was a huge shift. But perhaps like in this climate, it was what was able to pass and be successful and make all the other members who, might care enough about a pet, might have a pet, at least become more comfortable with the proposal. The other thing that really changed, and I think that this is probably for the better, was there were inserted implementation dates for the bill. So October 1 of this year is when the new rent structure will go into place. October 1 of the following year, 2026, is when the prohibition on breed discrimination will go into place. This is actually, I have a beloved pit bull chow chow husky mix who's an angel,
Oh, wow.
who's
Who looks like a full-bred golden retriever.
yes.
Care about that.
Which is
Yeah,
like
that's
shows,
valid.
yeah, right. He's like a perfect ambassador. You could put a baby arm in his mouth and he just like he's such a good boy. But I would love to just sort of like wave a magic wand and open all doors to all dogs, right? Especially, being a foster parent, now working with a local rescue, like I would love to open that door immediately. But the component that we haven't sorted out yet is the insurance piece. So if this had gone into effect earlier, are we providing the adequate protections for renters and homeowners and landlords? Probably not. What this delayed implementation allows us to do, it gives us the time to get the insurance component over the finish line, which we're hopefully going to be pursuing this spring, this year.
And the $300 cap on the pet security deposits is grounded in research. So
Yeah.
Susan mentioned this earlier. There's a couple of pieces of research out there that suggest that, most damages that would be caused by a pet that would be covered by that type of deposit don't exceed $300. So this is an example of in this space where we have been able to create some data-based recommendations, not in every facet, because frankly, there just isn't yet data available. I think one piece of data that we're really missing is around industry-wide how pet fees, the non-refundable fees, are in fact utilized. So I think we're missing some really key data so far to sort of help create fair guidelines for what these types of fee structures look like, but we're working in that direction. The only other piece I wanted to mention, and this bill was a huge success in so many ways, but the only other piece I wanted to mention is that we were initially advocating for no non-refundable fees or pet rents for affordable housing. So subsidized affordable housing, with the idea being that people are living in affordable housing, subsidized housing, rent restricted housing, because they are not able to afford market rate housing, right? And so we also know from research that most pets that are relinquished to animal shelters, so not strays necessarily, are coming from communities that are higher on the social vulnerability index scale. So these are our communities that are lower income. They live in neighborhoods that are racially and economically discriminated against, segregated. And so we know that these are the people who are not, and of course, this is kind of broad brush. SVI is a very broad brush kind of data point, but we know that it's not higher income people, by and large, that are relinquishing their pets due to these housing and other human-based issues. It's people who are already struggling to pay for food, to pay for housing, to pay for medical care, to pay for the things they need for their children and themselves. So we really wanted to take away the financial barrier, or one of the financial barriers for lower income households in DC. That was unfortunately removed, but in large part due to broader issues with subsidized affordable housing funding within the district and sort of the state of housing, of affordable housing in the district, and not necessarily because of this specific, pet related policy. I think it got caught up in some bigger picture issues there, as these things are wont to do.
Awesome. I saw, Susan, did you want to answer? I saw a question over, and we have another question.
No, I think one thing that I think is worth just mentioning, I think Lauren has definitely alluded to it, is, I think what we are definitely seeing is that pet ownership is becoming an equity issue. It is, the Class A apartments that are being constructed, pets are like the #1 amenity. I mean, the new, beautiful high rises, they know that that's a marketable point for individuals, households that have means, that are able to pay higher rents. It really is, the housing that's affordable to lower income folks that is way more restrictive. And, so, there's this dichotomy between, the haves and have-nots in this space of pet ownership. And what we know is that, there are all of these benefits that accrue to households with pets, and we don't want to, create another inequity in this particular space. And there's ways to avoid that. And, one place is, ensuring that when we're investing public funds in housing, affordable housing, that, that they do allow pets in that housing. And, that's really important. I think the other piece, I mean, we've got just, a little touch of data in Colorado to show that within the market, there really is a dearth of pet-friendly, pet-inclusive housing that's affordable to folks that are on the lower income of the income spectrum. So, given all of that, and then you combine that with access to veterinary care and the cost of veterinary care and, the mobility to get to veterinary care where there are, veterinary deserts, there are all of these barriers now for, individuals that are struggling financially to keeping their pets. And that's really unfortunate because anyone who has a pet obviously knows, all of the benefits that come with the love of that, of a cat or a dog that's in their household.
Might add, is it okay? Just that we have research there's research that shows us that pet policies, even in market rate housing, are applied in discriminatory ways. So there's 2 research articles out there to date, one based out of Texas that I was a co-author on, and one out of North Carolina that show specifically in the North Carolina study that in already racially and economically segregated counties, Forsyth County in particular, that the housing that was available to people who were living in the majority non-white areas of the city had not only less access to housing that allowed pets at all, but even within the housing that allowed pets, there was more likely to find breed discrimination and more likely to find these higher uses of higher fees. In the Texas study, we found that low income census tracts were actually more likely to have housing that had additional fees on top of rent, and that they were the base rent itself was much higher for pets allowed housing than base rent for housing that didn't allow pets. So even outside of the additional pet fees, we're also seeing base rents that have this base rent increase associated with housing that allows pets. So I say all this just to point out that pet policies are not separate from other types of fair housing policies, and that we should be thinking about this in the context of all housing related issues and recognize that those trends are existing and how we're seeing pet policies applied and where pet inclusive housing is available.
Lauren, if I may, there's the empirical data that you just indicated about what exists. What's the root cause of that? What did your research show you?
So the research doesn't suggest causation. It just shows the geospatial patterns, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So these are part of what I would argue are part of long-standing trends in discriminatory housing policies. And some of that is grounded in historic housing related discrimination through long-term consequences of things like redlining, long-term consequences of lack of investment in proper housing in segregated neighborhoods. And I think that there is continued discriminatory practices in housing that are just modern day discriminatory processes, separate from the consequences of historical big picture policies like redlining and such.
One of the things that makes it very difficult, because we can celebrate a lot of wins with the Pets and Housing Act, with Roscoe's Law, but there's also, it exposes even more gaps, right? The items that were cut that Lauren was just describing. So say we establish a pet-friendly homeless shelter, that's great. Where is that family or that individual going to go next, right? Like, where are they going to be able to afford housing next with their pet? And so I think that even though, you know, we can celebrate these gains, there's still just like a lot more work to do. We're gonna find more gaps the more work we do.
Agreed.
Awesome. I think we had a question over here.
Hi, everybody. I am a reporter with the Washington Informer here in the district. I am asking this question, though, as a homeowner. So outside of rents or renters, affordable housing laws, what other laws are there for homeowners or that homeowners need to know about outside of insurance? And I'm asking this because I live in a neighborhood here in Ward 7, one of those segregated neighborhoods, and we are pet lovers, but many of us aren't taking care of our pets, and there's, you know, dogs running around and there's incidents of what have you. So some of us in the civic association, starting with that early point of advocacy, are trying to understand as pet lovers, what can we do? What are the starts? We've even had, I think, ASPCA or some organization that's now coupled with the district and public safety come and speak with us. So what else should we be knowing about and educating ourselves on and talking with our neighbors on, and also figuring out what next steps are if needed?
I personally I don't do a whole lot in the homeownership space. So I think probably most of us are in the rental housing space. The thing that maybe comes to mind that I don't know is applicable, we, and Susan can speak to this too, but we've been working lately on HOA related, but that's also still in the restriction space, less in the, I guess, for lack of a better word, like responsible pet ownership space. But you know, I'm not sure, maybe even things like advocating for more, like I know in our neighborhood, we have one trash can in like, you know, a 4-block radius, maybe even things like that to just make it more accessible for people to be able to navigate things like pet waste in a neighborhood.
Well,
Yes.
actually,
So, oh, go ahead.
oh no, please, Susan, I'll go after you.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, so the way that pet ownership is typically regulated is it's under police power, which is delegated to local government. So it's, you know, in furtherance of, you know, health and safety. And so oftentimes you'll find that in local codes, you know, that the things that are applicable in your neighborhood are gonna have to do with things like, you know, what are the maximum number of pets that can be in a property? And that's sometimes a very important thing in animal welfare, because some individuals, in the name of compassion and caring, end up hoarding animals, which is not a good thing either. So things like vaccinations, things like tethering, things like nuisance, you know, all of those things can be found typically in local ordinances that apply. And so probably a lot of the things that may end up being problematic in terms of the harmony of your community are going to be regulated through local government, and can be, you know, new laws can be created to kind of address particular circumstances, you know, and obviously there's going to be a lot of stakeholders in that, and, you know, a similar process to what, you know, Kelly and Lauren have already described, you know, to get an ordinance through. But you know, really is the local government. And so I would, you know, look at, you know, if it's, if you're in the city, you know, or if you're in the district, then, you know, looking at the code of ordinances is probably the best place to kind of reference.
If I may, as a pet inclusive housing provider, one of the things that we do understand is that not everybody truly understands how to socialize particularly in an apartment community, which is different than necessarily a neighborhood. But I think there's a lot of the similarities in that. So we do educational programming. We bring in trainers, we do things, so we have dog runs. And so how do you socialize your dog within the dog run? I didn't know how to do that. And maybe reaching out to, frankly, Petco has a great community base where they'll send somebody out to do trainings for you. And maybe that's something that your community could get involved in and have a day at the dog run on how to socialize your dog or how to do this, that, or the other, or understanding why dogs do what they do. I've spent the last 10 years trying to figure out why my dog does what it does. It's a fascinating thing. So I think education is a really big part of it. And when we work with our residents who have dogs, I indicated that we do this kind of interview, we try to figure out if this is an owner who's responsible and somewhat educated on how to maintain their dog or their cat. I think that goes a long way, but then we add to that the ability, the opportunities to learn even more and be better stewards of the animals that live with us.
Kelly, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I mean, so I've been with Humane Rescue Alliance for 3 days. But I
Said a
was.
week.
Just say it confidently, no, that's no question.
But like one thing that I know that they are like working on will launch this year is a veterinary clinic on MLK. And so I think that one of the things that I've been in my early conversations with the team have been talking about are what are services and how that should be, accessible to community members. Is that and how they can be expanded and how they can be sort of mobilized. Like you might have a senior citizen who has a beloved pet, but who might not have any transportation to take them to a veterinary clinic that's very far away, or to a groomer. There's medical grooming that will help, like trim nails, that will help reduce infections, that will help, with matting, things that then like harm an animal who's loved and cherished, but someone might not have like the resources or knowledge of what already exists. So like there are, actually I left a vaccine clinic that we were hosting up at HRA to come down here today. So I think there's more diligence that is needed by people who are trying to provide services, and to provide like the sort of things that ease, the financial burden of pet ownership, because it really, pet ownership's for everybody. So I think that, there's so many people who love their animals, but, who might need additional support. And so I think that there are, certainly resources in the district that are there, and maybe it's more of like an outreach to sort of like connect with those folks who I think. And I just love that maybe like your community's like, oh, we see these animals, we want to help and support them and their owners. Because I mean, ideally, it's a matter of perhaps like owner education and better owner responsibility for their animal. And that's also a public safety issue.
Absolutely.
I think the only thing I would add, everything that y'all have said is, I think it's very community specific, right? Like what people might need for this in my neighborhood might be different than another neighborhood, right? So I think understanding, is this stemming from a lack of access to something? Or is this stemming from a lack of knowledge of like what it can do to people's yards, or, if there's like a lot of pet waste around, or if there's dogs that maybe, to David's point, are not well socialized. But I am always hesitant to look to legal solutions to these kinds of issues, because we know that most often people are not accessing vaccines, they're not accessing spay neuter services, they're not accessing things like poop bags that they need to pick up their dog's waste because it's a cost issue. And so when you rely on laws to punish people for not following those things, then that doesn't really necessarily fix the problem, right? Because if they can't afford it to begin with, or they don't know, or something, then ticketing somebody isn't necessarily going to make that better. So I guess that's my only addition is we often look to, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so, we often look to like changes in the law to find solutions for these things, and often those legal changes that are punitive aren't really effective. So I don't know, just maybe like one other addition to that. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Ooh.
Oh.
I wanted to ask about the People in Paws Coalition and what you guys see as like the vision for the future of it. You've talked a lot today about like the human animal connection, and I imagine there are other issues that involve that aren't just housing. And so I'm wondering if the coalition is interested in taking on those types of issues, or if it's more just like this discrete project of trying to foster this legislation through and then getting the insurance provision passed, and or if there's a longer term vision of like political advocacy and becoming like a more, having fundraising and financial power and certain other vehicles for making change.
People in Paws pack.
Exactly.
Well,
fundraisers.
take on this question.
Yeah, well, I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, especially for advocacy this spring, like I mentioned. We won't have, unfortunately in the district, if legislation that has a fiscal impact statement of FIS isn't funded within 2 years, that legislation is automatically repealed. So, this spring, we're all gonna have to reorganize ourselves. I think we've taken a little bit of a breather after the end of year holidays to push for that budget investment. We are going to have to reorganize for the insurance provision. I think there's also some interest in being open to other community needs, even just like sort of like closer regional needs, that could like, have the Venn diagram of like what we've been focusing on so far. But as someone and as a couple of us in this room helped also even just design the logo on our own, I think additional support would be great, or growth of expertise and input. I say this all the time, like I come to a problem from my perspective, and my perspective is not always right. So I think the more people who are interested and want to get involved, or who, the thing about like organizing a coalition or organizing legislation is that shift in mindset of, oh, that really bothers me, to I can help fix that, or at least try, right? And I think that happened for me one year when it was like a freezing night and I was walking to my bus stop and I passed a gentleman who was unhoused with a pet, and I was like, oh, I hate that they're both out here, and now we get to be a part of like the solution to fix it. So I think if there's anything in the future for the coalition, it's our immediate needs, and then perhaps like expanding to more communities.
Yeah. And we have some follow-up research.
Yeah.
That we're excited about. So in Susan, the A passed really like the first bill in the country in Colorado to regulate multiple aspects of pets and rental housing. And I've been part of some research to understand how the passage of that bill affected the market. So what you hear sometimes is that if you pass legislation like this, people are going to exit the pet inclusive housing market, which we now know from David is like not necessarily what happens, because having pets can be such a great benefit to keeping tenants and to your business. And so what we found in Colorado is that we have data now to show that the pets allowed housing market actually didn't have a long-term impact on that pets allowed housing market, which was kind of the threat that if you pass this, we're going to leave the market. So we're working on similar research for DC with another volunteer. So I think that's going to be a really great component of seeing like how the market is impacted. DC is a different rental market than Colorado. And I think that I would like to see some opportunities to get involved also with assessing how the law is being implemented. So I can say from my own perspective as somebody who's worked on these issues in multiple states, we kind of like we passed the law, and then we're not really the groups who are working on enforcing that law and implementing that. So since this is such a hyper local coalition based effort, I think it makes a lot of sense for the coalition to also be part of like making sure that once these are in effect, that those laws are being followed. I think that is often missing in a lot of our work, and and I think this is a great opportunity to dive into that a little bit. Those are just off the cuff of my head. I haven't talked about it. You can say no.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. This has been really exciting. I've learned a lot already, as I always do from you, and thank you all for being here and for engaging, asking questions, and please let us know if you want to talk more about pets and housing. I know we're all excited to talk about pet inclusive housing. So,
And just another plug that if you're interested in joining the DC Bar Animal Law Committee, feel free to email me or email Greg or get in touch.
yes.
Thanks, Susan.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank
And please help yourself to some food and we have to go.